The night respect was tested. Las Vegas in the late 1960s carried a kind of electricity that never truly slept. Neon bled into the desert night, casino doors breathed cigar smoke and laughter, and every hallway held secrets whispered between men who understood power without ever saying its name. On one such night, inside a packed showroom where the clinking of glasses blended with anticipation, Dean Martin prepared for what should have been another effortless performance. Another evening of music, charm, and laughter delivered with that familiar, unbothered smile the world adored. Yet beneath the tailored tuxedo and practiced calm, something unseen was tightening in his chest, a quiet tension he couldn't quite explain, as if the night itself had sharpened its edges in advance. Dean had performed thousands of shows, faced every kind of audience imaginable, from adoring fans to skeptical critics, from drunken high rollers to Hollywood royalty. He knew how to read a room, how to bend the air with humor, how to make people feel lighter simply by standing under a spotlight. But this night was different, not because of the crowd, nor because of the venue, but because of one man seated close to the front, an influential figure whose presence shifted the mood before a single note was sung. The kind of man who didn't applaud to show appreciation, but to remind others he was watching. Word traveled fast in Las Vegas, especially when men like that arrived. Dean didn't need an introduction to know who occupied those seats. He had spent his career walking a careful line, professional, courteous, but never indebted. He took the stage, not favors. He sang, not promises. That distance had protected him for decades. Yet tonight, that unspoken boundary was about to be tested in a way that had nothing to do with contracts, money, or reputation, and everything to do with something far more sacred. Backstage, Dean stood quietly, fingers resting against a glass he hadn't yet touched, his thoughts drifting somewhere far from the laughter echoing beyond the curtain. Family had always been his anchor, long before fame, before Hollywood, before the suits and the spotlight. Long before people knew his name, there had been his brother, older, steadier, a presence that made the world feel navigable. That loss never announced itself loudly anymore. It lived quietly inside him, folded into memory, surfacing only in rare moments when the past pressed too close to the present. Tonight, without warning, it was about to be dragged into the open. When the knock came at his dressing room door, it wasn't hurried or polite. It carried the confidence of someone who expected compliance. Dean looked up, already knowing that this interruption was not accidental. The message was simple and unmistakable. Someone wanted access, and in this city, refusal carried consequences. Still, when Dean rose and followed the messenger down the narrow hallway, his posture remained relaxed, his face composed. Years in the public eye had taught him that calm was not weakness, it was control. The encounter itself unfolded without raised voices, without theatrics, without spectacle. Just words chosen deliberately dropped like stones. What began as casual conversation turned almost casually into something cruel. A name, a memory, a suggestion so careless, so dismissive that it struck deeper than any threat ever could. It wasn't an attack on Dean the entertainer or Dean the celebrity. It was an insult aimed at the dead, at a man who could no longer speak for himself. In that moment, every instinct screamed for reaction. Anger surged hot and immediate, the kind that demanded release. But Dean didn't move, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his jaw or step back. Instead, he listened, eyes steady, breathing even, allowing the silence between words to grow heavy enough to be felt. Those who watched expected a joke, a deflection, perhaps even submission. What they witnessed instead was something far rarer, a man choosing principle over safety, dignity over ease. Dean's response didn't come from bravado or bravely postured threats. It came from certainty, from the kind of quiet conviction forged long before applause ever followed his name. He spoke not as a performer, but as a brother. Each word was measured, respectful, and unyielding, drawing a line that could not be crossed without consequence. He made it clear, without shouting, without violence, that some things were not currency in the games of powerful men. Some things were sacred. The hallway grew still. Even those accustomed to intimidation felt the shift. Calm, when rooted in truth, carries a force that noise never can. Dean wasn't trying to dominate the moment. He was defending something that mattered more than reputation, more than comfort, more than fear. And in doing so, he changed the balance of the room. When he finally turned away and walked back toward the stage, his steps were unhurried, his expression unchanged. To anyone watching, he looked exactly as he always had, unbothered, composed, ready to entertain. But inside, the cost of restraint burned, a fire he carried alone as the curtain rose and the applause erupted. The audience would never know what had just happened behind the scenes. They would only see the polished exterior, the effortless charm, the voice that made the world feel lighter for an hour and a half. What they could not see was the strength it took to remain calm when provoked in the most personal way possible. What they could not know was that a line had been drawn that night, one that would echo far beyond that showroom, altering how power, respect, and dignity intersected in the shadows of Las Vegas. This was not yet the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The silence that terrified the room. The curtain had barely fallen when the weight of what had happened began to settle into the walls of the building itself. Applause still echoed faintly in the corridors. Laughter spilled from the showroom as patrons drifted toward the casino floor, yet behind the stage, something far heavier lingered in the air. Word traveled fast in Las Vegas, but tension traveled faster. And tonight, it moved with a sharpness that made even seasoned men uneasy. Dean returned to his dressing room without looking back. His smile, the one the audience believed in, the one cameras loved, had already faded the moment the stage lights dimmed. Inside the quiet of the room, he loosened his tie slowly, deliberately, as if rushing would somehow fracture the control he had fought so hard to maintain. His hands were steady, but his chest felt tight, crowded with memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Bill's face hovered there, uninvited but welcome, carrying the same quiet strength that had guided Dean through childhood, poverty, and the earliest days of doubt. Outside that door, men whispered. Not fans, not staff, men who understood power in a language older than contracts and applause, the kind of men who knew when something had gone wrong, not loudly, not violently, but deeply. A calm confrontation was far more dangerous than a loud one. Anger could be dismissed, silence could not. The mob boss sat where he had been left, unmoving, long after most of the audience had risen. His associates glanced toward him, then away, unsure whether to speak or wait. They had expected a different outcome. A joke brushed off, a nervous laugh, maybe even submission. What they had witnessed instead unsettled them, not because Dean had threatened violence, but because he hadn't needed to. He had stood his ground without spectacle, and that kind of strength didn't fit neatly into the rules they understood. One of the men leaned in, voice low. "You want us to handle this?" The boss didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, his fingers drumming once against the armrest before going still. He had been challenged, quietly, publicly, and with witnesses who would remember every detail. Worse, he had been forced to apologize, not shouted into submission, not cornered physically, but guided there by a man who refused to bend. That humiliation burned hotter than any insult ever could. Back in the dressing room, Dean poured himself a drink he barely tasted. The adrenaline that had carried him through the performance drained away, leaving behind something raw and aching. He sank into the chair, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor as memories pressed in with merciless clarity. Bill teaching him how to throw a punch, how to take one. Bill standing between him and older boys in the neighborhood. Bill working long shifts without complaint, proud not of fame, but of family. The insult hurled that night hadn't just been cruel, it had rewritten a man's life into something unrecognizable. Dean could not allow that to stand. He never would. A knock broke the silence. This one was hesitant. His manager stepped inside, face pale, eyes darting back toward the hallway before the door closed behind him. He didn't sit. "Dean," he said carefully, "people are talking." Dean didn't look up. "They always do." "This is different," the manager replied. "You didn't just offend someone, you cornered him. You made him apologize in front of his own people." Dean finally raised his eyes. They were calm, but there was no softness in them now. "He disrespected my brother." "I know," the manager said quickly. "And God knows I understand why you did what you did, but men like that don't forget. They don't forgive easily." Dean took a slow sip, then set the glass down. "Neither do I." The manager exhaled, rubbing his face. "There are ways this could escalate. Bookings, security, problems that don't look connected at first." Dean stood, his movement unhurried but decisive. "If this turns into something bigger, that's on him, not me. I won't trade my family's dignity for safety." The manager stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. He had worked with Dean long enough to know when an argument was already lost. "All right," he said quietly, "just be careful." After he left, Dean remained standing, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The tuxedo, the hair, the image, it all looked unchanged. But he knew something fundamental had shifted. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and the consequences were already forming, quietly, patiently, like a storm gathering far out at sea. Across town, in a private suite thick with smoke and murmured conversation, the mob boss finally spoke. His voice was low, controlled, but edged with something dangerous. "He embarrassed me," he said. "Not with fists, with restraint." One of the men scoffed. "He's just an entertainer." The boss turned slowly, eyes sharp. "That's what makes it worse. He didn't need power, he didn't need muscle, he needed principle, and he used it." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. This wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about restoring balance, about deciding whether this challenge would be punished or buried. Either choice carried risk. Acting rashly could draw attention. Doing nothing could look like weakness. And somewhere in the city, Dean sat alone with his thoughts, fully aware that the night was far from over. He had defended his brother's memory, and he would do it again if needed. But even calm courage casts a long shadow, and shadows have a way of attracting things that prefer the dark. By dawn, Vegas would still shine, still pretend nothing had happened. But beneath the glitter, a quiet reckoning had begun, one that would test not just Dean's resolve, but the very meaning of power, respect, and restraint in a city built on fear disguised as glamour. The calm response that shocked everyone had not ended the conflict. It had awakened it. When power met an unmovable line. Dean Martin. Morning arrived in Las Vegas without apology. The sun climbed over the desert as if nothing unusual had happened, washing the strip in gold and pretending the night before had been just another blur of music and money. But beneath that brightness, conversations were already unfolding behind closed doors, voices low, careful, measuring every word. What had happened backstage had not stayed backstage. It never did. In this city, silence spoke louder than headlines, and the absence of public scandal only made the private tension sharper. Dean woke early, long before the house stirred, the echo of the previous night still alive in his mind. He sat at the edge of the bed, hands clasped, breathing slowly, deliberately. He had slept little, not from fear, but from memory. Bill had filled his dreams not as a ghost, not as a tragedy, but as he had always been. Solid, quiet, protective, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. Dean realized, with a faint ache in his chest, that the strength people admired in him had never really been his own. It had been borrowed, learned, passed down from a brother who had taught him how to stand without shouting. By mid-morning, the phone began to ring. The first call came from a friend in the industry, voice careful, half joking, half serious. "You stirred the water last night," the voice said. "People noticed." Dean listened, said little, ended the call politely. Then another rang, then another. Each conversation followed the same rhythm, concern wrapped in admiration, warnings disguised as advice. No one scolded him openly. No one told him he was wrong, but every voice carried the same unspoken question: was it worth it? Dean never hesitated with his answer, even when he didn't speak it aloud. Across the city, the man whose authority had been challenged sat in a quiet room far from the neon lights, staring into a glass he hadn't touched. The apology still tasted bitter in his mouth. Apologies were supposed to flow one way in his world, from the weak to the powerful, from the frightened to the feared. What made this different wasn't just that he'd apologized. It was that he'd meant it, if only for a moment. That moment haunted him because it had been real, and real things were dangerous. His associates argued in murmurs. One urged retaliation, said a lesson needed to be taught. Another advised restraint, warning that a public figure like Dean brought attention that couldn't be controlled once unleashed. The boss listened without interrupting, eyes fixed on nothing. He knew both sides were right. Violence would be easy. Silence would be harder. Silence would require swallowing pride. By afternoon, a decision was made, not to strike, but to probe. That evening, Dean arrived at the studio for a scheduled rehearsal, unaware that he was being watched more closely than usual. Not followed, not threatened, simply observed. Men in suits lingered longer than necessary. Conversations paused when he passed. It wasn't intimidation, it was assessment. They wanted to know if the man who had stood so calmly the night before would flinch now that the moment had passed. He didn't. Dean greeted everyone the same way he always had, warm, polite, unchanged. He sang through his rehearsal without missing a note, joked with the band, corrected a timing issue with gentle humor. To anyone looking for cracks, there were none, and that unsettled them more than anger ever could. Late that night, when Dean finally returned home, another knock came at his door, not loud, not aggressive, just firm enough to announce intention. When he opened it, a man stood on the porch, well-dressed, respectful, eyes sharp with intelligence rather than threat. This was not a messenger of violence. This was a messenger of consequence. "I won't take much of your time," the man said calmly. "I'm here to talk." Dean studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "You've got 5 minutes." Inside, the man spoke carefully, choosing words like tools. He acknowledged what had happened. He admitted the insult had crossed a line. He also explained, without menace, without raised voice, that pride once wounded had a way of demanding payment. The world they lived in ran on reputation. Humiliation, even deserved, left scars that rarely healed cleanly. Dean listened without interruption. When the man finished, silence stretched between them, heavy but controlled. Then Dean spoke, his voice steady, his tone unyielding. "You came here to see if I'd regret what I did. I don't. You came to see if I'd soften. I won't. What was said about my brother was wrong. That's the beginning and the end of it." The man nodded slowly. "You're aware this could make things difficult." Dean met his eyes. "Some things are already difficult. Living with silence after someone you love is insulted is one of them. I chose the harder road. I'll keep choosing it." The messenger stood, smoothing his jacket. "I'll pass that along." When the door closed, Dean leaned against it briefly, feeling the weight of the choice he had made settle fully onto his shoulders. This wasn't bravery fueled by adrenaline anymore. This was resolve. Long-term, costly, unavoidable. Elsewhere, when the message was delivered, the room went quiet again. The boss listened, jaw tightening, then relaxing. "He won't bend," he said, not angrily, almost thoughtfully. "That kind of man doesn't bluff." For the first time, respect crept into his voice. Not admiration, not forgiveness, but recognition. He understood now that this wasn't a challenge he could win by force. Breaking Dean would require destroying something larger than a career. It would mean destroying a principle, and that kind of destruction never stayed contained. By the end of the week, the pressure eased, not because the danger had vanished, but because a boundary had been acknowledged. Lines had been drawn, not in anger, but in conviction. In a city where fear usually ruled, something quieter had asserted itself. Dean returned to the stage days later, greeted by roaring applause. To the audience, he was unchanged, effortless, charming, untouchable. But those who truly understood what had unfolded knew better. They knew that somewhere beneath the velvet curtains and polished lights, a powerful man had been forced to confront something he could not buy, threaten, or erase. And Dean Martin, without raising his voice, without throwing a punch, had become something far more dangerous than an enemy. He had become immovable. The apology that changed everything. Time did not explode the way everyone expected it to. There were no sudden threats, no mysterious accidents, no whispered ultimatums delivered in dark parking garages. Instead, the days that followed stretched out in an uneasy calm, the kind that presses against the nerves because it feels temporary, like the stillness before something decides whether to become a storm or dissolve into air. Las Vegas kept breathing, kept glittering, kept pretending nothing had shifted. But Dean could feel it in the way rooms went quiet a half-second too early, in the way conversations resumed only after he passed, in the way powerful men now watched him with something dangerously close to curiosity. Dean understood something most people didn't. Real danger didn't announce itself loudly. It waited, it studied, it learned. And so did he. He went on with his life exactly as before, not because he was fearless, but because fear was not allowed to dictate his choices. He performed, traveled, laughed, drank with friends, played the role the world expected him to play. But in quieter moments, alone at night, sitting with a glass untouched, he replayed that hallway in his mind, not the insult, but the silence afterward. That silence had been the turning point. Silence was where power had shifted. One evening, weeks later, Dean received a call that made his manager's voice falter in a way Dean had never heard before. A request had come in. Not a demand, not a warning, a request. The man who had humiliated himself by apologizing now wanted to speak again. Alone, no audience, no leverage, just words. Dean didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, watching the city pulse beneath him, and thought of Bill, thought of how his brother would have handled this moment. Bill would have listened. He would have measured the truth of a man not by his reputation, but by what he did when no one was watching. "Tell him I'll meet," Dean said finally, "on neutral ground." The restaurant was quiet, private, tucked far from the strip's noise. No spectacle, no witnesses worth impressing. When Dean arrived, the man was already seated, older than Dean remembered him, shoulders heavier, confidence no longer effortless. For the first time, Dean saw something unexpected across the table from him. Not dominance, not arrogance, but restraint. They didn't speak right away. Silence returned, thick but different now. This silence wasn't charged with threat, it was loaded with reflection. "I've been thinking about what you said," the man began at last, his voice lower, stripped of bravado. "About family, about lines you don't cross." Dean listened without expression. "I crossed one," the man continued, "and I knew it the moment you didn't react the way I expected." Dean raised an eyebrow slightly. "You expected fear." "I expected anger," he admitted. "I expected noise. Instead, you stood there like I wasn't worth the effort." That admission landed harder than any apology could have. In his world, being ignored, calmly and deliberately, was the deepest wound of all. The man swallowed, then said the words again, this time without force, without witnesses, without pride attached. He apologized, not because he had been cornered, but because he understood what he had done. He spoke of his own losses, his own dead, the ones he never mentioned because power demanded hardness. For the first time, Dean saw him not as a mob boss, but as a man who had spent decades confusing fear with respect. Dean finally spoke. His voice was steady, not forgiving, not cruel. "My brother doesn't get a second chance at life," he said, "but his memory does. That's what I protected." The man nodded slowly. "And in doing that," he said, "you showed me something I forgot a long time ago." They parted without handshakes, without promises. None were needed. Something had settled into place, something irreversible. From that night on, the pressure vanished, not dramatically, but completely. Doors remained open. Threats evaporated. Dean's name was no longer spoken casually in certain rooms, not out of fear, but out of respect. He had become untouchable in a way violence could never achieve. Years later, long after Vegas had reinvented itself yet again, the story would resurface quietly among those who understood real power. Not as a tale of intimidation, but as a lesson. A reminder that dignity, once defended without compromise, changes the balance forever. Dean Martin never told the story publicly. He didn't need to. The people who mattered already knew, and Bill, if the universe had any justice at all, knew too. Because sometimes the strongest response isn't loud. Sometimes it's calm, unyielding, and rooted in love. And that kind of strength leaves, echoes long after the music fades. The legacy no one could touch. Years passed, but some nights never truly end. They simply fold themselves into memory, waiting for the right moment to resurface. For Dean Martin, the confrontation that should have destroyed his peace instead became a quiet turning point, one that reshaped how powerful men spoke his name when he wasn't in the room. Vegas changed, faces changed, alliances shifted, but the line Dean had drawn remained untouched, like a boundary etched into stone rather than sand. From the outside, his life continued to look effortless. Sold-out shows, standing ovations, laughter that rolled through theaters like a warm tide. People still saw the charming crooner, the relaxed entertainer who made everything look easy. What they didn't see was how carefully Dean now listened to silence, how attuned he had become to what wasn't said. Power had introduced itself to him in its rawest form, and he had answered it without flinching. That kind of exchange leaves a mark, not visible but permanent. One late evening, long after another flawless performance, Dean remained alone in his dressing room while the building emptied around him. He hadn't turned on the radio, hadn't poured a drink. He simply sat there, jacket draped over the chair, staring at an old photograph he carried in his wallet. Bill stood in front of their father's barber shop, sleeves rolled up, smiling like the world hadn't yet learned how to be cruel. Dean traced the edge of the photo with his thumb, feeling the familiar ache rise and settle in his chest. "I did right by you," he said softly to the empty room. Outside, footsteps approached. Not hurried, not heavy. When the knock came, it was gentle, respectful. A younger performer stood at the door, nervous, eyes bright with admiration. "Mr. Martin," he said, voice unsteady, "I just wanted to thank you for the show and for something else." Dean studied him. "For what, kid?" "For standing up," the young man said. "People talk, they always do. They say you didn't raise your voice, you didn't threaten anyone, you just refused to bend. That matters to people like me." Dean felt something shift inside him then, not pride, not satisfaction, but responsibility. He realized that the night he defended his brother hadn't just changed how powerful men viewed him. It had changed how quieter people measured courage. Strength, he understood now, was contagious when expressed without cruelty. After the young man left, Dean sat alone again, but the room felt different, lighter, as if something unfinished had finally been completed. Years later, when illness began to slow him and the applause gradually softened, Dean found himself reflecting not on fame or fortune, but on moments like that one night in Las Vegas. He had faced a force most people spent their lives avoiding, and he had answered it not with rage, but with resolve. He had chosen love over safety, loyalty over convenience, memory over silence. When the man who had once mocked his brother eventually died, a letter arrived, quietly, privately. It thanked Dean not for entertainment, not for success, but for dignity, for showing that power without conscience is fragile and that real strength doesn't need permission. Dean folded the letter and placed it beside Bill's photograph. In the end, that was the legacy no one could touch. Not money, not fear, not reputation. Just a man who knew who he was, where he came from, and what he would never surrender, no matter the cost. And that was why the story endured, not because a mob boss was challenged, not because danger was avoided, but because a brother was defended with calm, unwavering love. That kind of strength doesn't fade. It echoes. What endures after the applause fades. Dean Martin. There comes a moment in every life when the noise finally recedes, when the applause softens, the lights dim, and a man is left alone with the sum of his choices. For Dean Martin, that moment arrived not with fear or regret, but with a clarity so sharp it felt almost peaceful. The city that had once tested him now moved around him with a different rhythm, as if it had learned where not to press. Dean had grown older, slower in his movements, but steadier in his spirit. Fame had long since stopped surprising him, and danger no longer announced itself the way it once did. Yet sometimes, late at night, he would sit quietly and think about how close everything had come to turning another way. One wrong word, one raised fist, one moment of surrender. Any of those could have rewritten his life entirely. Instead, he had chosen stillness, and that choice had reshaped everything that followed. People still came to see him, still lined up for the chance to hear that familiar voice wash over them. But more often now, it wasn't the songs they wanted. It was reassurance. They wanted to believe that decency could survive power, that dignity could outlast fear. They saw it in him, whether they could explain it or not. Dean had become proof of something the world desperately needed to remember. One afternoon, while sorting through old letters and photographs, Dean paused over an envelope worn thin with age. Inside was a note written in careful handwriting, words chosen slowly, deliberately. It spoke of respect earned, of a lesson learned too late but not too late to matter. Dean read it once more, then placed it gently beside Bill's photograph, the two artifacts now inseparable in his mind. One represented love, the other represented consequence. Together, they told the truth of his life more honestly than any headline ever could. Dean understood then that what he had done years ago was never really about winning or surviving. It had been about refusing to let cruelty pass unchallenged simply because it wore authority. He had stood firm not as a celebrity, not as a powerful man himself, but as a brother. And in doing so, he had forced others to confront a version of strength they didn't know how to fight. When younger artists asked him for advice, he never spoke about contracts or negotiations. He spoke about boundaries, about knowing what mattered enough to risk discomfort, about staying calm when the world expected you to break. He told them that anger was loud but fragile, while composure, true composure, could move mountains without making a sound. As the years continued to roll forward, stories about Dean took on a life of their own. Some exaggerated, some misunderstood. But the core of it remained intact. A man had been pushed and he had not yielded. Not violently, not dramatically, but completely. And that was what endured. Long after the last encore, long after the city reinvented itself again and again, the lesson remained quietly intact. You could take away the stage. You could dim the lights. You could silence the music. But you could not erase the moment a man chose principle over fear, love over convenience, memory over silence. Dean Martin's calm response did more than shock a room. It altered the balance of power in ways no one saw coming. And in the end, that calm became his truest legacy.